everybody in the world.
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. And before we get into our second segment of the day here on today's show, I do want to remind you that if you feel so inclined throughout today's show, consider making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. Great way to contribute and interact with the show. You can also do it through our website as well, GSMC Podcast.net. Leave a tip or donation or a comment there, or just consider doing it through YouTube as well. Either way is greatly appreciated by all. It just makes the show that much better. I love hearing all your great opinions on all things fantasy sports. Without further ado, let's jump right into our second segment of the day, where we have to talk with the starts, we have to talk with the sits, because there are going to be a lot of players who you might want to avoid this fantasy football weekend. And so I feel like, it's kind of getting defined in terms of how this week is going to play out, because there are going to be a lot of intra-conference games and divisional rivalries playing out, but there are some games where it's just coming down to one team I can physically see dominating the other. It may not add up to a win or loss for that respective team, but I do think there are going to be some deficiencies revealed, some flaws revealed for certain teams this week, and it stems from some of these players struggling in certain situations. So without further ado, let's jump right into him, starting off with a guy who's pretty obvious I'm going to mention here at the QB position. It is, of course, Kirk Cousins. Unfortunately, Kirk Cousins' decline has been overtly rapid these past couple of weeks. Only over 6 interceptions and 0 touchdowns these past 3 weeks here for Atlanta. They still control their destiny there in the NFC South. As wild as it is, they have the tiebreaker over the Bucs, so it's forcing the Bucs to really win out here. But they still have to win at least 2 out of the 3 next games to ensure that they lock up that NFC South title. And I don't necessarily know if Kirk Cousins is fully capable, because the Bucs' schedule is a lot easier than the Falcons' schedule, and the Falcons' schedule starts off with a tough match against the Vikings. I believe they play the Commanders in about 2 weeks' time as well. So things are not going to get any easier for Kirk Cousins here. As much as people love him, and as much as he's had fascinating games these past couple of weeks in the season, I feel like he's starting to show that he simply has lost his luster as a starting QB in this league. Now, I'm all for keeping him in and not turning to Penix, because it shows that you're not necessarily trusting this investment, and Michael Penix Jr. is still a rookie, and he has very little starting experience in the NFL, let alone for a team wanting to make that playoff push. So I do feel that Kirk is going to remain the starter for the time being here, but if they slip out of the playoff race, you might want to see what Michael Penix Jr. has in the stretch. It's a disappointment in terms of the Falcons' investment in Kirk Cousins this season. So that's why I feel like in this game against his former team, he's going to really struggle to prove that he's a competent starting quarterback anymore in the National Football League. And then at the running back position, this just comes down to the matchup here and how I don't necessarily like this Bills offensive line protecting enough for James Cook against that feisty Rams defensive front. So that's why I think James Cook, unfortunately for me, especially as he's my running back in my personal fantasy league, is not going to necessarily play well for you. I do feel like there are moments where James Cook is going to have good games, but this is not one of them. This, and I'm going to mention this later in my NFL implications segment, is going to be a trench warfare battle. It's going to be won or lost in the trenches for both of these teams. And a matchup where I see the Rams winning is generating pressure on running downs against this Bills offensive line. I do feel like Jared Verse and Brandon Fisk are going to wreak havoc in the backfield, and it's going to be to the detriment of a guy like James Cook. I do think that the Bills are going to find ways around it, but it's not necessarily going to involve consistently trying to feed Cook and get him going, because they can find other ways to get going, we know. And it's not going to stem from trying to push the narrative that they can win this football game just by running it down the Rams' throats, because that's not going to happen. So that's why I think James Cook is going to suffer in this matchup. And then next, I'm trying to talk about DJ Moore here at the wide receiver position. Another one, funnily enough, of my personal fantasy players. You can tell I'm kind of reeling in my fantasy league right now. But I do feel like DJ Moore in this match with the 49ers, as much as I want to say, this could be a really interesting matchup here for him going up against these 49ers secondary pieces. I do think this has been a very disappointing season for DJ Moore in this offense. Seen potentially as the leader of it, potentially helping Caleb Williams in his first season, being that guy who has the experience in this offense, but he's really not necessarily stepped up for Caleb. And that's why the Bears are in a very tough spot right now. But I do think that Thomas Brown might be able to help that out a little bit, but definitely not in this game against the 49ers. I do think the 49ers, as decimated as they are on the defensive side of the football, still have enough to limit a guy like DJ Moore, who kind of feels out of it right now. You know what I mean? I feel like he's not necessarily that influential in this offense anymore. And it's to the detriment of this team, especially in late game situations where you need a guy who can be the difference maker for you. And that's why I don't necessarily see DJ Moore as effective of a fantasy asset as he was potentially in the middle of the season compared to now. And even though this offense I think will steadily improve, I can't necessarily see it to the point where, he's going to be a world beater these next couple of weeks, because the Bears are well and truly out of the playoff picture right now. And this is just about, trying to find the right pieces on offense. And potentially he could prove me wrong, but I don't necessarily think in this game he's going to stand out. And I might, sell him while he's hot, because he's definitely not played well for me these past couple of weeks, and potentially has cost me a couple games, cost me ground in the playoff race. So he's someone who I might even sell high this weekend, just because of the fact that, he hasn't really proved he can be a wide receiver one there in Chicago. Then the tight end position, this is a guy who I've tried to be high on these past couple of weeks, but has had a weird season thus far in the Steelers offense, and going up against a divisional rival in the Browns for the second time in 3 weeks, I think that he's either going to be an X factor or a bust for you. It's Pat Freiermuth. I'm leaning more towards bust in this one, just because of the fact that the last time we saw this matchup, we saw Russ really try to force a lot of throws downfield, and it was a really hit or miss offensive approach for Pittsburgh as a result. And so I feel like that could be the case yet again, even if the Browns and inclement weather don't necessarily come out as passionate as they were back then 2 weeks ago. But I still think it's going to be a tough matchup for Freiermuth in terms of getting meaningful targets. I do think that he could be a huge presence in terms of what he can be able to do to open up space down the field for Wilson and Pickens to connect, but I don't necessarily think he's going to be influential in terms of his own production. He's one of those weird receivers who can be absent for the entirety of a game and then suddenly show up when it matters, but over the past couple of weeks, he's been more the former than the latter, if you know what I mean. And so that's why I can't really justify seeing Pat Freiermuth be consistent enough for you down the stretch, even though he's playing meaningful games. Because as I see it, the best parts of this Pittsburgh Steelers offense is Wilson's willingness to go downfield. If he's not comfortable with doing that, then I do believe Pittsburgh can get a little bit exploited when he has to work underneath and is forced to do that. And so, even though I appreciate Pat Freiermuth for what he can be for this Pittsburgh offense, he's going to have to prove it on the stretch, because none of these matchups are really favorable for Pittsburgh, if you want me to be honest with you down the stretch here. They have to play the Chiefs on Christmas Day, the Eagles the week before that. So I just feel like down the stretch in these couple of games, we're going to really see if Pat Freiermuth is elite. But it's funny that I think that he's not going to show up in this one because it's against the Browns. But then again, it's a divisional game, and the Browns have already proven that they're passionate enough to beat you the first time. So why not the second time? And even though it's going to be a huge X factor in this one, if he does get going, I don't necessarily see it for the entirety of the game. So that's why I feel like Pat Freiermuth could prove me wrong, but also I feel like is going to disappoint more often than not in this one, and that's why he sits on my sit list for this week. And then for the defense, I feel like the Raiders' defense is going to be a disappointment this week. I do believe they're playing the Buccaneers. Let me really check that real quick because I don't want to sound like a fool. They are playing the Buccaneers this week. And the reason why I say this is because I do feel like the Raiders can make this a game, right? They prove that they're still passionate enough to compete against the NFL's elite. They made that game really kind of tough for the Chiefs to pull out in these last couple of minutes. They had that weird mistake at the end of the game where the center snapped the football before O'Connell was even ready, and that really cost them. But in this specific matchup, you're facing a very aggressive Bucs team who's fighting for their playoff lives right now. You don't necessarily want to go up against a ticked-off Bucs team. You don't want to go up against a ticked-off Baker Mayfield. And that's the reason why, even though this Raiders defense can really make things muddy for Bucs, I feel like they're not going to show up wholeheartedly. They expended a lot of energy in that matchup against the Chiefs. That was their Super Bowl, and this one I think they'll be a little bit less motivated against a Bucs team that's really amped up for this playoff stretch for them. So look for the Raiders to come out a little bit flat in this one, but overall, I feel like all of these hits have something in common. They're in very specific matchups where their flaws are completely ready to be decimated, right? Because I feel like in most of these matchups, either there's a clear advantage for the opposing team, or it's just going to come down to, improvisation for some of these teams, right? Like in the case of James Cook. But other than that, I think it's pretty clear that a lot of these players are not going to be highly coveted this week. Let me know what you think about them all in the comments. But coming up next on our show, we switch over to some big implications in terms of fantasy. It's one of the NFL's biggest games of the weekend. Tune in to see which ones I feel will give you a lot of fantasy production right after this short break.